Well, welcome to the Museum of Anthropology at UBC in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I'm Dr. Jennifer Kramer. I feel quite privileged to be one of the curators responsible for the First Nations Northwest Coast collections here at MOA, as we're known. And I'm also an associate professor at UBC. I teach cultural anthropology and museum anthropology curation. And as you are about to learn, I am very excited to share with you MOA because it is an incredible university museum, quite extraordinary. We've been a museum here at UBC since the 40s. We moved into this building in 1976. But before I share about the building, the most important thing that we always want to recognize is that we are on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And so you're looking at me in front of the first displays that you would see if you came to MOA, which are Musqueam, one of the Hunkaminam speaking Coast Salish peoples of the Northwest Coast. Coast Salish runs from northern Washington all the way to southern British Columbia and into the Fraser Valley. And the reason why I say we acknowledge the land we're on, and if it wasn't raining, I would take you out to our Musqueam Welcome Plaza, because there the Musqueam people welcome us to this place, and they have named our plaza Remember Your Teachings, and to point out that we all have cultural heritage that tells us who we are, that makes us proud of our identity. And it also is filled with artwork created by Musqueam artists and carvers such as Joe Becker and Susan Point. So you see a welcome figure, you see a beautiful mosaic made by Susan Point called Salish Footprints. And it reminds our guests that as you walk over this artwork, this isn't just art, this is about the history. We're talking 9,000 years of Musqueam stewardship of these lands and waters. So this is a history that is so much larger and longer than Vancouver. And so when we walk over Salish Footprints, it reminds us, yes, these are beautiful artworks, these are treasures that embody people's history and identity, but they're also active belongings. They do social work, they do political work, they do cultural work. And so the Museum of Anthropology is really proud that we have excellent relationships with Musqueam and with First Nations up and down the coast, across British Columbia, and actually Indigenous communities around the world. We have global collections. So welcome to MOA, and we'll be walking down our ramp, which is sort of like virtually walking up the Northwest Coast. So you start right here at Musqueam, and belongings, which is the term that Musqueam likes us to use about their material treasures that represent them. And in fact, we're also proud that Musqueam considers us their museum. They literally, besides this being unceded territory, which means a treaty was never signed to remove them from this land, they have reserve land within 2 kilometers of here. So, welcome, come on in. What you'll see is that this display area, this museum, which opened in 1976, It has a really interesting architecture than what you might expect from a typical anthropology museum or a museum of world cultures. I always say, isn't it interesting, you're not seeing a kind of marble Greek temple like you would at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, right? Instead, when you come here, you almost can't see the museum because it's embedded in the landscape. And the Canadian-Scottish architect Arthur Erickson was very much inspired by the large longhouses and big houses of the Salish and also the more northern First Nations Northwest Coast peoples, which had these giant cedar beams and cedar house posts. So you're looking, for example, at what might have been on the inside, what was on the inside of longhouses for the Coast Salish, or over here, Vince Stogan's house post that was out front, right nearby. So we have examples of the architecture that Arthur Erickson was inspired by. He also was inspired by Japanese architecture and the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, right? So this falling waters where you're embedded within the land, and that's part of who you are. So come on in. We have, since the 70s, displayed First Nations carvings and treasures and belongings to emphasize the incredible masterworks that they are, but we've also embedded contemporary artwork in to make the important point that First Nations are alive and population is increasing, and they are continuing to create treasures in these lands, and they're doing it in interactive ways, learning from other communities, borrowing. So, for example, this piece by John Marston, who's from Vancouver Island, he's a Salish carver, was inspired by an exchange that he had with Teddy Balangu, who's a ʼwakw man from the Sepik River of Papua New Guinea. And Teddy has a long-standing relationship with one of our senior curators, Dr. Carol Mayer. And so he met John, and they went to each other's, carving sheds. So Teddy went to Vancouver Island. My understanding is he experienced snow for the first time. And then John went to Papua New Guinea. And so this piece is a mixture of Salish-inspired carving styles as well as ʼwakw. We run the whole gambit from archaeological material, but mostly I would say our First Nations collections are around the beginning of the end of the 19th century all the way up to the present. So what you're seeing might look like it's from the far past, but it's not. Most of these, let's go on in and you can see some of the poles and carvings that we're known for. Kwakwa house posts that would be inside and outside, sort of holding up the main post and beam structure of big houses. I can show you a picture of what I'm talking about. So this is a big house with these giant beams, and these houses would hold, hundreds of people sometimes. And they would have, this one doesn't have its roof or its sides, but you can see how this post was used. It's a bear, and it's basically a story of a history of the chief and his family who lived in that house, and the first ancestors that built that house. And so literally their history is in the structure of the house.
So it looks like a beautiful carved piece, but really it has a lot of meaning behind it.
It's basically a materialized ownership papers of not only the house, but the rights to gather food and resources from the land and waters. And that's what all these carvings are. They're materialized representations of people's ancestral history. And they still have active force today. So one of the things we're most proud about at the Museum of Anthropology is that this is not a museum about the past, preserving something just because it's cool. This is a museum connected to the present and for the future. And so we work with First Nations and Indigenous peoples from around the world who come here, whether to be inspired by the hands of their ancestors or to do research to find out about their prerogatives that are used during their ceremony and their ownership, and stewardship of the lands. So for example, let's say this is a feast dish, believe it or not, from the ʼwakw people of northern Vancouver Island and the matching mainland, sort of above Vancouver, but below the central coast. And Potlatch is where this would be brought out, where all this important governmental, political, social work, where you or I might celebrate a wedding or a naming of a leader or a celebration of a buying or building a new house. All the same celebrations were done during what's sort of generically on the coast known as a potlatch. And so what you do is you'd invite people to witness the work of what you were sharing, whether it was naming a baby, whether it was a coming of age for a young woman, whether wedding, memorializing the dead, and you would feed your guests. And you would feed them well, just like we would in any birthday party or wedding. And so when you brought out your feastware, it's kind of just like you or I bringing out perhaps our grandmother's china or wearing our mother's jewelry. We would be dressed in our best. It would represent who we were. And even the feast dishes told the history of how your family came to be on that land.
So how do these pieces come to you? Do you find them or do they find you?
That's a really interesting question. They come in all different ways. One of the things that's quite different about this museum is that the majority of our ʼwakw collection were actually sent to us and sold directly by ʼwakw community members. And the reason for that, and this was in the 50s, the early 50s, was that the first founding director and curator, Harry and Audrey Hawthorne, hired a man named Mungo Martin, who was a ʼwakw fisherman as well as a carver. I apologize for the noise. And he told people in his homeland of Taxis, which is Fort Rupert, it's known as on northern Vancouver Island, that if they wanted a safe place to send their belongings, this would be a place. And so they were bought here. And what that means is that we're really only a few generations removed from the people that sent these belongings to be protected here. And one of the things, let's move in and I'll show you some of our spaces. One of the things that we're most proudest about is when community members come, they're very welcome to research the collection, not just in the digital catalog, but coming and spending time with the belongings. But if it makes sense, for example, that an object go back home to do work, whether it's to be put on the head of a chief, or to be loaned for a potlatch, or to be brought home so that an artist can make a copy, or whether to be repatriated, they do that work here. This is visible storage, for which actually we were, as far as I know, the first museum in the world in 1976 to have open visible storage. Now it's quite common, usually most museums have the majority of their collections behind the scenes, so not really accessible. And before digital cataloging became de rigueur, people, would have to make private like emails to contact curators to go see belongings, and it wasn't easy. So the idea when we opened in 1976 was to make our collections as democratically accessible as possible, without being displayed through a curator's eye in a specific exhibit, whether temporary or permanent, but basically just to put everything out and accessible for people. But we very quickly realized, that in the 70s, that even though we thought we were neutrally displaying all these incredible belongings, we actually had imposed museum classification systems on them. So in the early 2000s, we worked to do a giant renewal of the museum called a Partnership of Peoples, a new infrastructure for collaborative research. And the curators worked with the communities of origin, whether First Nations, Northwest Coast, or Indigenous people, or, we have collections that aren't just Indigenous, we have world collections, and say, how would you like to see your belongings in the way that makes sense to you? So for example, we were talking about ʼwakw, We have quite a large ʼwakw collection because of that relationship of selling over 900 pieces of regalia, from button blankets, dance outfits, transformation masks behind you, talking sticks, coppers, how to display them. And so the curators worked with different First Nations communities saying what makes the most sense to you so that it represents your value systems, your spirituality, your ways of honoring these material representations of your ancestors. We do have some contemporary art mixed in, so it's not just all from the past. So for example, this is a Bo Dick ʼwakw transformation mask. He was an incredible artist from Kinkum Inlet that also worked as an artist in residence at UBC in the art history department here. But he was also deeply connected to the Museum of Anthropology. So we were talking about potlatches, which is this incredible, what Marcel Mauss, a sociologist, called a total social fact. It embodied economics, politics, the legal regime, social work, any kind of thing that you needed marked and remembered. This was a grouping of ceremonies where people publicly displayed who they were and did not need written language because basically you were paying your guests to remember what they saw. And people would speak their histories with talking sticks that represented their ancestral histories, represented on the sticks, represented on their totem poles, worn on their button blankets. All this history would be shown. They would dance it, they would sing it. It all talks about this legal government regime of place and identity. And so what's happening, what you might not know, is that Canada actually banned the potlatch from 1884 to 1951, making it illegal to gather together. They knew very well that this was the organizing governance structure of First Nations, and we were in a colonial situation. They also felt that what was going on during potlatching seemed to them to be not Christian, not safe. So it's been banned. In 1951, it's now been allowed, and since then, potlatching has been increasing, has been coming back. People have been using it to assert their land rights, because for most of British Columbia, treaties were not signed. People were put on reserves without agreeing to what was going on. We're still in a contemporary treaty process in British Columbia. So these belongings, this regalia that does the work in a potlatch at home in a big house, we want to be part of that work that's ongoing now, whether it's legally through the Canadian court system, whether it's the return and strengthening of potlatching ceremony to do this work of recognizing land stewardship. And so people come, chiefs come, matriarchs come, elders come, and they say, you know what, that was my grandmother's talking stick, or that was the copper that belonged and represented my family and our box of treasures, which holds all the prerogatives and rights we have. And so we're part of that active work. And so yes, that's collaboration. That's where it's exciting to me. That's about taking what maybe museum people in the past would call objects, or even scientists might call artifacts. We don't really like those words because it makes it sound like those are things from the past. That's why we use the words of treasures, of regalia, of belongings, because it shows they have active work that they're still doing. And some of that work is here in the museum, where guests like you from around the world come and learn about the significance, ongoing significance of this work. And some is the work they can do back home. And that work might be through digital research, like our collections access terminals, our online collections access. They can research. But some of it might be coming here to MOA and bringing out these belongings and spending time with the hands of their ancestors. So we have embedded research rooms for that here, and let me show you. But what I did want to say was, so for the ʼwakw, we were talking about these two spaces. It was important to them, I mean, a typical art history museum for example, you would arrange by the name of the artist, right? All the Picassos together, right? So we do know the names of famous ʼwakw artists and carvers. That's not a problem. We do know Dick Hawkins, Willie Seaweed, and those names, Doug Cranmer, those names are passed on. They were the teachers. We know those art schools. But what's interesting is it isn't important who carved these belongings, because the work they do in the Potlatch, it's about the families who have the rights to show these masks, to show these treasures, to show their connections to the land. So we wouldn't necessarily then arrange these masks by, oh, all the, Dick Hawkins here, all the Willie Seaweeds there. So we said, how should we organize them? Should we organize them by the families that they were connected to? Well, that's a wonderful idea, but colonialism and Canadian assimilation and also intermarriage meant that these prerogatives moved around. A lot of people were taken away from their traditional village sites and are no longer living there. Some have gone back, some have reconnected, some are still there. But it would have been a very difficult challenge, because though 900 of these belongings came directly from ʼwakw community members, many came from, we had wonderful patrons who gave us funding, Walter Kerner, McMillan, I can't think what his first name is, that gave us funding to purchase. And so they purchased at galleries and they purchased from collectors. And at that point, maybe the names of the original owners or the names of the carvers were not known. So the solution that we came up with, working with ʼwakw people, was let's put it in the order that these different regalia would come out during a typical potlatch, as if there was an potlatch. But yet every family's potlatch would be different things would occur. But it's like a wedding. We have in Europe, let's say, Euro-Canadian, we have a set idea of what a Christian wedding or a Jewish wedding or a Muslim wedding would look like. So that's what we did. We arranged these as how they would come out, so that when you come as a ʼwakw person, it makes sense to you.
So that's part of your job as a curator then, is to determine how the pieces are displayed.
Yeah, but I would say your point about collaboration and community connection is that I am not an expert on, I have been privileged, I've been to potlatches, I've been to some of the villages and the centers of, let's say, ʼwakw life or New Hope life, but I am not an expert. And these are family genealogies that go back generations in memory. So we really try not to represent other cultures without them being involved. That's really a large part, I would say, about where museums in general are going, decolonizing. So instead of them being spaces where Western nations collected non-Western material culture and put it on display for their own reasons, we really want to be working with the communities of origin so that the messages they want come out. That's really important to us. I would say that MOA has been at the forefront of that, but I'm very happy to say actually that museums around the world are now decolonizing or indigenizing in the ways that they do exhibits or in the ways that they repatriate collections back to communities of origin.
Do you think Canada's done a good job of trying to right the wrongs of the past of the Indigenous people? Better than the United States?
I'm not sure it really matters about comparing. We have Indian residential schools here, just like you did residential schooling, boarding schools for Indigenous people in the States. We had repressive, if you want to look at it as religious laws, you couldn't potlatch, just like you couldn't powwow and do Sundance in the States. We were colonial when we were British, and we did try to assimilate. All those kind of things happened in the States. It's interesting, in the United States, there's a law I'm sure you're aware of called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was formed in 1991 to make it law that museums had to send inventories to American Indians in the United States. Canada does not have an equivalent law. We do have a task force agreement made between museums and First Peoples here in Canada to work together on exhibits, to work together on repatriation, to make sure that ancestral remains go home, funerary goods, treasures of significance. I think MOA is in a special place because we've always, since we began, worked with Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. Harry and Audrey Hawthorne were always working with the artists. They were actually, Harry hosted an economic conference which basically said, how can Indigenous people help their economic situation by selling crafts and artwork? So we were sort of earlier at realizing that this is an ongoing thing, that First Nations are not dying out. They're incredibly diverse, and we can work with them to promote.
I think that's interesting what you said earlier about it's not just selling the pieces, but it's also safekeeping.
Yes, so I mean, part of contemporary Indigenous lives is selling art to make a living, just like anyone else makes a living. But there are absolutely artworks that should not be sold, that are sacred. There are also artworks that should not be on display. So the first question we asked all the communities when we redid the Multiversity Galleries, Ways of Knowing, was what should not be on display? Should it not even be photographed and put on our access online? We have a culturally sensitive space behind the scenes, which has cultural protocols about who can have access and when. But we also have that as an issue. So you might see here one of our sort of, I would say, most educational displays is this wrapped mask done by a ʼwakw man, Mike Willey, who at the time in the early 2000s said, I don't like this. All of these belongings should not be shown all at once. They should come out one at a time, only in a big house, only during ceremony, only represented by the right family whose treasure box they come from. What are you doing showing them here? This is completely goes against our protocols. What are we teaching our youth who we're trying to bring back to this way of being ʼwakw? But at the same time that he said that, there were elders in the room that said, well, these were collected in the 50s. They are published in books. They are sold. Copies of these are carved by our own artists and sold in galleries in Gastown, in Seattle, in Alaska. What are you doing if you don't show them now? That just means that our 50% urban youth that don't live in Kingcome, that can't go to a big house, won't get to see them. So it was a problem. We didn't have a solution for it. Mike Willey didn't have a solution for it. So what we did was we are displaying the problem. So we wrapped an important wolf mask from Kingcome, from Mike Willey's family. The Kingcome was founded by 4 wolves. So this is their origin story. And he said these should only be brought out in a big house to do that work. So we wrapped it and we used first-person voice to say, this is an issue. We don't have an agreement. Or even this really important hamatsa material, which is the cannibal dance. It's the most important coming-of-age ceremony for the ʼwakw, where children are brought out into the wilderness and spend a year, and they become imbued with the cannibal spirit. And then they're brought back into community, and they're fully made civilized again. And it's very ironic because hamatsa was seen as one of the reasons why Canada wanted to stop the potlatch. They thought that these dancers were eating human flesh, were eating dead bodies, they were cannibals. It wasn't that. It was an elaborate rite of passage to actually civilize them back into what it means to be ʼwakw. So this is regalia, rattles, and these are the cannibal birds that come with ʼwakw, who's the great cannibal at the north end of the river. So all of these come out and are the most important secret society dance of the ʼwakw. We knew that these had all been sold by Chief Knox in the 50s to Audrey Hawthorne. And so when Karen Dufak, another curator, and I were working on the ʼwakw re-display, we went to Chief Knox's grandson, Peter, and we said, this is clearly culturally significant regalia, should it go back home? You know, should you have it? We don't need to have it. And Peter said, no, my grandfather said he needed to sell the masks to make money, to buy wood, to build a seine boat, because he was a fisherman. And he didn't sell the right to recarve more hamatsa masks. And in fact, he initiated Peter Knox, his grandson, into hamatsa at the first opening of a big house that was legal in 1953. So the prerogative went on. And so we tell that story. There's a picture of Peter and his wife, Mabel, to say, you know, for some people, repatriation is the right way to go. If something was illegally acquired here, sold by the wrong person, acquired in a way it shouldn't have been, then that is always an option. Someone can come and say, I think this shouldn't be here. But in this case, he said, no, this should be on display. I honor my grandfather's choice.
So there's even disagreement within the community.
Absolutely.
And then you have to be involved in this too.
Yes.
Okay, this seems like a little bit of an impossible situation for you.
Excellent question. So for example, where Bonnie is standing in front of a talking stick, a quite famous Heltzuk talking stick, it was this one, that was photographed by Edward Curtis, I'm sure you've heard of. We had a community member say, I'm hosting a potlatch, I'm reclaiming my chieftainship, I'm connected to this famous talking stick, can we borrow it for the potlatch? And had enough knowledge about whose it was and who had owned it for Karen and I and other curators to say, yeah, that seems reasonable. But then we were told by another curator from the RBCM, the Royal British Columbia Museum, that in his mind, and he was very connected genealogically to the Kwakwa, he was adopted in, he said he didn't think that family had the right to use that talking stick. And so you're absolutely right. Someone like myself, we don't want to be the one arbitrating ownership and family genealogy that has been really made complex by colonialism, assimilation, Indian residential schools, making speaking Kwakwa illegal, all these things that were pressures, poverty on people's lives. So what we did was we contacted that other family and said, hey, did you know this family is asking for this and we're hearing this may not be appropriate? And what the other family said was, yeah, we know they're making claims, let them do it. You know, this is something that has to be worked out in the big house. It's not for the museum to adjudicate. But sometimes we have community members who will come and say, well, what does it say in your records? You know, who sold it to you? And that can be very complicated too, because there is this Western idea that the written record is right. It's not always right. Lots of times we had belongings come in without the connection to the community. And even when they did come in from the community, things have changed, things have mixed up, you know, so they aren't the arbiter. From my perspective, the fact that you get a piece that was photographed, I think in I don't remember the date, 1914 with the chief, I think his name was Hamasaka, if I'm pronouncing it right. And it also shows the complexity of the intermarriages, right? That he was, I think he was from Rivers Inlet, ʼwakw, and that there was intermarriage. All of that is really exciting to have that time depth and then to see it being used into the future for new chiefs, for new people coming up and like, in the West, we tend to think of chiefs as someone who has power and authority. But actually on the Northwest Coast, a chief is someone who leads their people and is there to care for their people, is not there to be, you know, show-offy. I mean, even with the wrap mask, that was something I worked on. It's not that it's difficult, it's theoretically an interesting, museums like to classify things and organize them in certain ways, and those classification systems, I'll show you another example. How do you tell a very complex history of movement, of interaction, intermarriage, you know, difficulties of history, and then get that across to a public who maybe aren't reading any labels? This piece right here, actually came in from the Kwakwa. A specific person sold it to Audrey Hawthorne in the 50s. It was subsequently identified as Nuhulk, as from the Belakula nation, made by a Belakula carver. When it came in, we were told it was what's called an undersea kingdom mask. And the undersea chief was very wealthy. He lives in a copper house. All these sea creatures stick to him. You can see salmon, you can see this seabird. But then, after Bill Home, who was a famous art historian from Seattle, said, no, this is actually carved in Nuhulk style. You can see Nuhulk here. And then I brought it to the people I work with in Belakula and said, do you recognize this? And I work with this young man named Centicula, Clyde Talio. And he said, yeah, I know exactly what that is. That's a kilkta. A kilkta is a sticky sea monster. And that's why all these creatures stick to it. And kilkta means pitch. It means the sticky pitch of a tree. And he said, and not only that, that comes from my family, so I know where it comes from on my land. And he then spoke about it. So we had to make the decision, do we show it in the Nuhulk case, where we have far fewer treasures than the ʼwakw, just based on the sort of relationships that were developed. And we did talk to the ʼwakw people we worked with, and they said, we have a lot here. There's 2 bays of it. We have less than 100 treasures from the Nuhulk. Let's put it in the Nuhulk case. But that is a decision, right? And so it had to be done with the Nuhulk community.
So when people come in and they start talking about these objects and that they're familiar with them, do you record any of this?
Mm-hmm. If we can, if they permit us.
Because the stories behind these masks are so interesting. I know before you said you had docents that would come in the museum, and maybe that program will start up again.
Yes. Oh, no, it definitely will. We have these collections access terminals. So when Clyde Talio told me that story, I sent a graduate student, because we are a university museum, so we are actively doing research. I right now hold a grant called a Community University Engagement Sustained Grant between the Museum of Anthropology, UBC, and the Nuhulk Nation with Clyde Talio, who's their director of culture. But years ago, I have a number of grad students that work. I find these never work when someone's filming me. There we are. So these are site specific. I want to show you 11. Because what we did was I had my grad student Adam Solomonian, so there it is. That's the piece I want to talk about. Where did it go? Was it over there? I didn't see it. Maybe you're right.
Is this the one that you were
Yes, there you are. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So if you go to images and media.
In South Benwick, at that time, there was said to be that sticky monster, sticky sea serpent, Kilshta. The name actually means has pitch or glue all over his body. And they say that Kilshta one day was swimming after salmon, and the Asiaf River is so small that when he chased the salmon up the river, they got stuck to his cheeks, and he couldn't get them off. Another time, he was surfacing out of the water in the little bay there in South Benwick, right by the Asiaf. And a loon was sitting on the top of the water, and that loon got stuck to his head. And that's why Kilshta was represented with the salmon on his cheeks and the loon on his head.
So different curators have different relationships. It really does come down to personal relationships. So now Emerita Curator Pam Brown, who's Heiltsuk, she worked with the ʼwakw, which is right near her home country of Bella Bella. So Bella Bella, Rivers Inlet, and Nuhulk, Belakula are all close on the Central Coast. She had them record all the names of all the pieces that you can then have access to hear it online. But different curators did different things. But so this is Northwest Coast, but then we have world collections, and we have embedded research rooms, basically so that the public doesn't think about themselves just as passive, lookers, but as active, involved, that these are not things of the past that are dead behind glass, but that actually do things today. This is our most famous Raven and the First Men by Bill Reed, who was very well known as a Haida carver, but actually started his career as a CBC radio announcer. He had a American father and a Haida mother and was raised in Victoria. He has a very mellifluous voice. We have a multimedia guide that's available, on your phone with an app. And you can, for example, show up in front of Raven and the First Men and hear Bill Reed talking about this piece. And so you'll see there are various symbols that show the media guide, and you can hear throughout the museum. Well, one of the reasons, so this grant that I'm working with Clyde Talio, is that the New Hulk Nation is considering building their own museum. And Clyde and I have, as well as other New Hulk and Heiltsuk and ʼwakw, have traveled to museums around North America looking at collections. So we're working together on reconnecting Indigenous communities to their belongings. And they're working right now to figure out in Bella Coola, they're a small community of about maybe 2,000 people. Where do they want to put their resources? Do they want to pay to have lights in a museum and humidity control? Or do they want to build a space, for example, that more easily they could borrow objects back home, copy them, send them back? So from Clyde's perspective, they're very much working with museums. So I would say from that perspective, he'd like to see us stay here, pay for the expensive stuff of caring for these belongings in the way that Indigenous communities want them to be cared for, and then we work together on the projects and the methods of representation that they want. Other communities might say, no, burn Western museums down and send them home. That's where they need to be. But as you pointed out, in any community there's difference of opinion, lots of differences.
You do a lot of restoration here also?
Do you mean like
if you get a piece that, or you don't really touch anything?
No, it's not like restoring a painting. We only do conservation. We have 3 conservators. We have a conservation lab. We teach conservation at UBC, but we only conserve Indigenous belongings if the community approves and asks for. And what's really wonderful is, for example, if a mask is going home to be danced, a conservator might say, do you think this is okay? Do you want to dance it? And if you do, we can help you by supporting it in various ways. Sometimes the community says, no, it's too fragile. Sometimes they say, yeah, put back in another ear of the Thunderbird. It totally depends. It's all about the relationships. Great, and if you go around there, you can see our totem poles resting, sleeping while we're redoing the Great Hall, and when it comes up, you'll be able to see them again in this incredible space. And I'm sure you saw online, but you can also see video over there of what the Great Hall looks like and will look like again. And it is a place where we have all kinds of public events, Indigenous, academic, ceremonial, and that's like how I like to see this museum.
There are many buildings in Vancouver that are not seismically up to snuff, let's say. They're all over the city and here on campus as well. And so the university undertook an extensive survey of all of their properties and basically, using their criteria, prioritized what needed to be fixed first. And MOA was at the top of that list because of the treasures that are here and the risk of them being damaged or lost if we underwent some kind of seismic activity, but also because of the sheer number of people that we host. So looking at the value, the cultural and monetary value of the things that are in this building, but also the loss of life potential.